Welcome! In this video, we will demonstrate the complete rebuild of the Viking pump GB-414 series. This video will cover these pump models. Before you begin, please consult the appropriate technical service manual for safety information. A copy of the latest revision can be found on our website at vikingpump.com. To begin, make sure the pump is completely secured by clamping the bracket foot to a table. First, using a 3/4 inch socket, remove the head mounting foot. Use a 15/16 socket to loosen and remove the cap screws on the head end of the pump. Discard the cap screws. Next, remove the head. A pry bar may be required. Be careful not to damage the face of this component. Set the pump head aside for reassembly. You may then remove and discard the bushing block gasket, and O-ring. Remove and discard both the driven gear and driver gear, as well as the drive pin. Remove and discard the casing and alignment pins. A pry bar may be required. Remove and discard the O-ring. Next, remove the separation plate. Discard the 2 bushing blocks, gaskets, and O-ring, but retain the separation plate and the spacer for reassembly. Remove and discard the driven gear and shaft, the driver gear, and drive pin. Next, remove and discard the casing and alignment pins. Use a 15/16 inch socket to loosen and remove the cap screws on the bracket end of the pump. Discard these cap screws. Next, remove the ported separation plate. Set this aside for reassembly. Remove the 2 bushing blocks and bushing gaskets, as well as the spacer. Discard the bushing blocks and gaskets, but retain the ported separation plate and the spacer for reassembly. Discard the O-ring. Remove and discard both the driver gear and driven gear, as well as the drive pin. Remove and discard the casing and alignment pins. Remove and discard the bushing block and gasket. For seal removal, loosen and remove the seal holder cap screws using a 3/8 inch Allen wrench. If necessary, use 2 of the cap screws as jack bolts to slowly press out the seal and shaft. Use the tapped holes at the 9 and 3 o'clock positions. You can now remove the seal and shaft. Using a 3/16 inch Allen wrench, loosen and remove the bearing end cap screws. Remove the outer snap ring. Retain the seal holder assembly and bearing end cap for reassembly. You may discard the other seal components and the shaft. Prior to reassembly, ensure the pump head, separation plate, ported separation plate, and bracket are clean and free of debris. It is recommended to complete all sub-assemblies before starting to rebuild the pump to ensure all components are in place. Begin by applying O-ring grease to the bushing block gaskets and inserting them into the grooves of the bushing blocks with the protrusions down to aid with adhesion. Do this for all 6 bushing blocks and gaskets. Next, apply O-ring grease to the O-rings and insert into the grooves on each pump casing section. Apply O-ring grease and insert O-rings into the grooves on each separation plate and the pump head. Install each driven gear and drive pin onto their corresponding driven shaft and insert an external retaining ring on each side in the grooves. Each gear set needs to remain with their corresponding serialized casing. The serial numbers can be found on each gear and the casing. Finally, apply anti-seize to the head and bracket cap screws, as well as the seal holder and bearing end cap screws. It is now time to begin rebuilding the pump. Apply light oil to the bushing block and bracket bores. When installing, make sure to line up the bushing block pin with the groove in the bracket. It may be necessary to use a soft-headed hammer to gently tap the bushing block into place. Be careful not to damage the faces of the bushing block. Next, using the snap ring pliers, install the external retaining ring to the shaft. Install the shaft through the motor end of the bracket. Install the alignment pins into the bracket. Install the casing. Install the drive pin and coat the driver shaft with light oil. Install the driver gear. Apply light oil to the driven gear and driven shaft assembly and install. Next, coat the spacer, ported separation plate bushing block, and bores with light oil. When installing the spacer, ensure that the groove lines up with the pin at the bottom of the ported separation plate bore. When installing each bushing block, ensure that the pin lines up with the corresponding grooves on the spacer. Next, coat the bushings with light oil and install the ported separation plate onto the shaft. Install and tighten the bracket cap screws. We will torque these to their specified setting toward the end of the installation. Install the next pair of alignment pins. Install the casing. Next, install the drive pin and coat the shaft and driver gear in light oil. Install the driver gear. Coat the driven gear and shaft with light oil and install. Next, coat the spacer, separation plate bushing blocks, and bores with light oil. When installing the spacer, ensure that the groove lines up with the pin at the bottom of the separation plate bore. When installing each bushing block, ensure that the pin lines up with the corresponding grooves on the spacer. Install the separation plate. Install the next pair of alignment pins. Install the casing, ensuring that the O-ring is in place. Next, install the drive pin and coat the shaft and driver gear in light oil. Install the driver gear. Coat the driven gear and shaft with light oil and install. Coat the pump head bores and bushing block with light oil and install. Make sure to line up the pin with the groove in the pump head. Lubricate the driver and driven shafts as well as the bushings with light oil. Then install the pump head. To ensure that the pump is assembled correctly, make sure that the stamped characters are all on the same side of the pump. These can be found on the head, both separation plates, and the bracket. Install the head cap screws and tighten. Finally, torque all of the cap screws, both head and bracket. The torque procedure involves 3 rounds. First, torque in a crisscross pattern to 75 foot-pounds. Next, torque to 115 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. And finally, torque to 150 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern. Do this for both the head and bracket cap screws. Install the pump head mounting foot. It is now time for the seal installation. Begin by cleaning the seal holder assembly thoroughly. Next, install the stationary seat into the seal holder assembly. Make sure to line up the notch with the pin in the face of the seal holder assembly. Remember that the face of the stationary seat has been lapped to a mirror finish. Any damage will affect the sealing ability of the mechanical seal. Coat with P80 lubricant and install. Apply O-ring grease to the seal holder O-ring and place in the groove. Place the seal washer onto the shaft, making sure that it is fully seated against the snap ring that was previously installed. Install the seal spring guide. making sure that the spring guide is fully seated against the seal washer with the cupped section of the spring guide facing outward toward the motor end of the shaft. Coat the shaft and the inner diameter of the mechanical seal with P80 lubricant and install. Make sure the seal spring is fully seated within the spring guide. Clean the seal faces with a lint-free cloth and isopropyl alcohol or another suitable cleaner. Install the seal holder assembly with the seal housing drain in the 6 o'clock position and tighten the cap screws in a star pattern. Turn the pump input shaft by hand to check for free rotation. Install the retaining ring into the groove on the shaft. Next, coat the thrust bearing in light oil and install onto the shaft. Make sure the printed letters on the outer race of the bearing are facing outward. Install the bearing end cap. Tighten the cap screws in a star pattern. Install the beveled retaining ring with the bevel facing outward toward the motor end of the shaft. Pulling the shaft away from the pump while installing the beveled snap ring will ensure proper installation into the groove. Torque the seal holder assembly cap screws to 120 inch-pounds. Torque the bearing end cap screws to 96 inch-pounds. Finally, turn the shaft manually to ensure the pump rotates smoothly. Your Viking GB-414 series pump is now ready to be put back into service. For more information, visit our website at vikingpump.com.